The last of the sun was a thin, molten line on the western ridge, bleeding its gold into the indigo tide of evening. In the kitchen of the white clapboard farmhouse, Eleanor struck a match. The small, sulphurous bloom flared in the gloom, and she touched it to the wick of the first lamp. A softer, warmer light pushed back the shadows, pooling on the worn oak of the table and glinting off the cold iron of the stove. She moved through the downstairs rooms with a practiced rhythm, her slippers whispering against the floorboards. Each new flame a tiny defiance against the encroaching dark, the parlour, the dining nook, the front hall. Each space awakened, familiar and yet profoundly altered in the quiet. It was the hour of return. Her daughters would be on the road from town now, their figures small against the vastness of the fields. The thought was a comfort, a point of gravity in the wide, silent expanse of the house. This silence was a new tenant, having moved in with the frost of the previous November. Before, the evening would have been filled with the solid, expected sounds of her husband John, the thump of boots by the door, the clearing of his throat, the rustle of the almanac as he planned the next day's work. Now the only sounds were the ones she made herself and the old house's gentle complaints, a creak from the stair, a sigh of wind at the eaves. Her preparations for supper were complete, a pot of bean stew keeping warm at the back of the stove, a loaf of yesterday's bread under a cloth. The waiting time stretched before her, a delicate hollow space. She went to the cupboard in the hall and took down the mending basket, its woven willow handle smooth under her fingers. Settling into John's armchair by the parlour window, she felt the worn fabric of the arms, the slight depression his form had left behind. It was not a sadness that overwhelmed her here, but a presence, like the impression of a leaf in stone. From the basket she drew one of his work shirts. The blue chambray was faded to the soft grey of a dove's breast, thin at the elbows and frayed along one cuff. She threaded a needle with sturdy navy thread, the action automatic, her fingers remembering what her mind did not need to guide. The lamplight caught the silver in her dark hair, pulled back into its customary no-nonsense knot, and illuminated the fine lines that fanned from the corners of her eyes, lines etched by sun and squinting into distances, and more recently by a different kind of weather. The needle began its journey, in and out, in and out. The rhythm of it was a quiet metronome, a stitch in time. Each pull of the thread drew the torn edges of the cuff together, making it whole again, or at least serviceable. There was a profound solace in the task, in the tangible act of repair. It was an answer to the slow, inexorable unravelling of things. As she worked, her gaze drifted to the window. The world outside was dissolving into silhouette, the skeletal shape of the oak tree, the dark hump of the barn, the long lane that disappeared into the gloom. Fireflies began their intermittent signalling in the tall grass by the fence line, tiny living lanterns flickering without pattern. She thought of Ruth and Clara walking that lane, their arms likely linked, their heads bent together in conversation. Ruth, 22, with John's serious eyes and a steadiness that seemed older than her years. Clara, just 14, all restless energy and sudden questions, still trailing the bright dust of childhood. They were the reason for the lamps in the windows, the warm food, the ordered house. They were the living threads that kept the fabric of this life from coming completely apart. The shirt cuff was soon reinforced, her stitches small and even, a testament to a lifetime of such care. She smoothed the fabric with her palm, feeling the slight ridge of her work. It would hold. She placed the mended shirt on the arm of the chair and rested her hands in her lap, listening. A faint, distant jingle of harness, the soft murmur of voices carried on the still air. They were here. The waiting was over. The silent house, which had felt so vast and echoing a moment before, seemed to draw in a breath, readying itself to be filled. Eleanor rose, her silhouette tall and straight against the lamplight, and went to the door to welcome the night inside. The crunch of wheels on gravel and the soft blow of a tired horse announced them before the door opened. Eleanor stood in the wedge of lamplight spilling onto the porch, the evening cool settling on her shoulders like a shawl. The buggy emerged from the deep blue twilight, its black shape resolving into familiar details, the worn leather seats, the patient sway of the mare Bess, and the two figures nestled side by side. Ruth held the reins with a competent looseness, her profile calm against the darkening sky. Clara, a smaller shadow, turned and waved, her movement quick and bird-like. Eleanor's heart, which had been a quiet, steady drum in the silent house, found a new rhythm, fuller and more complete. She stepped forward as Ruth brought the buggy to a gentle halt. The sounds of their arrival were a symphony that banished the quiet, the metallic jingle of the bit, as Bess shook her head, the scuff of boots on the stone step, the rustle of fabric and paper parcels. Clara was first, launching herself from the seat with an energy that seemed undimmed by the long day, her arms full of a wrapped bundle. "The milliner's wife sent the thread you wanted," Clara said, her voice bright with the importance of the errand. She pressed the small packet into Eleanor's hands before turning back to help her sister with the heavier bags. Ruth was alighting with more grace, smoothing her skirt, her expression softening as she met her mother's gaze. In that look was the entire unspoken report of the day, its minor trials and small satisfactions. They moved into the warm-lit house, bringing with them the scent of dry road dust, fresh ink from the stationer's, and the cool mineral smell of the coming night. Clara bustled about, unwinding her scarf and hanging her coat on the peg with a practiced flip. Ruth set the market bags on the kitchen table with a solid thump, already beginning to unpack the necessities: a block of salt, a paper of sugar, a small waxed parcel of butter. The kitchen, which had felt like a stage waiting for its players, was now animated. Eleanor lifted the lid of the stew pot, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam that fogged the window pane. Clara set the table with 3 bowls, 3 spoons, the thick slices of bread on a chipped plate. Ruth filled the water pitcher from the pail by the sink, the liquid splashing clear and cold. They moved around each other without collision, a dance perfected over countless evenings, their silence companionable and full of unspoken communication. They sat. The simple act of bowing their heads, of taking up spoons, was a ritual that sealed the public world outside and ushered in the private one within these walls. For a few moments there was only the sound of eating, the gentle clink of pottery, the tearing of bread. It was Clara who bridged the gap between the day out there and the night in here. Between mouthfuls of stew, she recounted the peculiar request from a customer at the dry goods store where she worked after school. A man had come in asking for a specific outdated calico pattern, one with tiny repeating images of steam locomotives. He had been adamant, describing it in minute detail, convinced a bolt must be hiding in the back room. Her imitation of his bewildering persistence, her hands sketching the imagined trains in the air, brought a faint smile to Ruth's lips and a soft chuckle from Eleanor. Ruth, methodically sopping up the last of her broth with a crust of bread, offered her own news. At the dressmaker's shop where she was a seamstress, a woman from the next county had purchased the entire remainder of a particular emerald green silk. It was an extravagance, a bolt of luxury that had sat for months, and its sale felt like a small victory. She described the colour, how it shimmered like a beetle's wing in the light from the front window, and the woman's quiet, pleased expression as she arranged for its delivery. Their conversation was a gentle tapestry, woven from these ordinary threads. Clara spoke of a new litter of kittens in the alley behind the store, all grey tabbies with white paws. Ruth mentioned seeing their neighbour, Mrs. Gable, at the post office, her arms laden with letters. Eleanor listened, adding only a word or two of question or acknowledgement, her eyes moving between their faces, Ruth's composed and thoughtful in the lamplight, Clara's animated, her expressions fleeting as clouds. This exchange was more than mere recounting. It was an act of weaving their separate days into a single shared fabric, reinforcing the connections that distance and work had temporarily stretched. As the stew was finished and the bread reduced to crumbs, the talk gradually softened, turning inward. Clara's anecdotes gave way to a yawn. She tried unsuccessfully to hide behind her hand. Ruth's shoulders lost a fraction of their disciplined straightness. The energy of arrival had been absorbed, transformed into the warm, tired contentment of being home. The world outside the circle of lamplight, the dark fields, the silent road, the town now closed up for the night, felt very far away. Eleanor rose to fetch the apple pie she had saved from the noon meal, cutting 3 modest slices. This final sweetness was another stitch in the evening's seam. They ate it slowly, almost languidly, the sweet spice of cinnamon and nutmeg, a comforting finale. The day's peculiar customer, the sold bolt of silk, the kittens, the letters, all these fragments settled into the quiet of the kitchen, becoming not just events of the day, but part of the family's history, stored away with the taste of pie and the feeling of warmth. Finally, Ruth pushed her empty plate away with a soft sigh of completion. Clara rested her chin in her hand, her eyelids drooping. The bridge between day and night had been crossed. The public faces they wore for the world were gently set aside, leaving the private, unguarded selves that belonged only to this house, to this table, to the soft light that held the darkness at bay. Eleanor looked at her daughters, their features softened by fatigue and the gentle glow, and felt the silent house around them, not as an emptiness, but as a vessel, perfectly filled. The supper things held the ghost of the meal, a film of broth in the bowls, crumbs like scattered pollen on the checked tablecloth. The ritual of clearing began without a word, a seamless transition from nourishment to neatness. Ruth gathered the plates, her movements economical and sure, stacking them with a soft clatter. Clara collected the spoons, their silver dull in the dimming light, and carried them to the deep porcelain sink. Eleanor remained at the table for a moment, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, listening to the first sounds of water being pumped, the heavy splash as it hit the sink's basin. Then she rose, taking the empty stew pot, its iron sides still warm, and joined her daughters in the kitchen's warm heart. The room was dominated by the wood stove, a slumbering beast of black iron that radiated a drowsy, penetrating heat. Its fire had been banked for the night, but its residual warmth filled the space, pressing against the cool air seeping from the windows. A single kerosene lamp sat on the shelf above the sink, its flame flickering gently in the draught, casting a restless golden pool that made the shadows in the corners seem deeper and more fluid. Ruth had already rolled up the sleeves of her blouse, her forearms pale and capable as she worked the bar of lye soap into a froth. The scent of it, sharp and clean, cut through the lingering aromas of onion and thyme. Eleanor took up a linen drying towel, its weave softened by countless uses, and stood beside her eldest daughter. Ruth washed, her hands moving with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She would scrub a plate, rinse it under a stream of clear water from the pump, and then pass it, dripping, into her mother's waiting towel. Eleanor would receive the warm, slick china, enfold it in the cloth, and dry it with slow circular motions, her eyes on her daughter's profile. Clara, tasked with putting away, flitted between the cupboard and the women, a silent, eager sprite, her bare feet whispering on the linoleum. For a time the only sounds were the domestic symphony, the clink of china, the swish of water, the creak of a cupboard door, the soft abrasive whisper of linen on glaze. The world beyond the windows had dissolved into absolute blackness, making the kitchen feel like a ship's cabin adrift on a dark sea, warm and self-contained. It was into this rhythmic quiet that Ruth introduced a new note, her voice low and measured, blending with the other sounds as if it belonged to the same score. She spoke while scrubbing a stubborn spot of crust from a bread plate, her gaze fixed on her task. She mentioned a letter, received that afternoon at the post office. It had come from a town 2 counties over, a place of unfamiliar streets and unknown faces. The sender was a man, a distant connection through an aunt, a schoolteacher with a tidy script and, according to the aunt, prospects of a principal's position. Ruth described the letter's contents with a careful neutrality, inquiries about her health, comments on the unseasonable warmth, a polite admiration for the industry of a woman who could both sew and keep accounts. Her words were flat, factual, but beneath them ran a current of something else, a faint vibration of possibility that altered the very air in the room. Eleanor listened, her drying motions never faltering. She watched the play of lamplight on the curve of Ruth's cheek, the slight tightening of her jaw as she relayed the suitor's careful compliments. Each piece of china Eleanor dried became an artifact of this moment. The plain white soup bowl, the fluted edge of a dessert plate, the sturdy mug. As she polished them to a mute shine and handed them to Clara, her mind did not travel to that distant town or the unknown schoolteacher. Instead, it journeyed backward, drawn by the undertow of her daughter's voice, into the deep channels of her own youth. The heat from the stove seemed to shift, becoming not the dry heat of a kitchen in a 1920s farmhouse, but the damp, heavy heat of a Carolina summer long past. She was not standing at a sink but sitting on a porch swing, the chains groaning a familiar song. The scents were of honeysuckle and cut grass, not lye soap. The voice in her ear was not Ruth's measured tone, but John's, lower, warmer, edged with a nervous courage that made her own heart flutter like a caught bird. His words had not been about accounts or weather, but about the way the moonlight silvered her hair, about his hopes for a piece of land, about a future he desperately wanted her to share. The feeling that came with the memory was not simple nostalgia, it was a physical echo, a ghost of the thrilling, terrifying vulnerability of being chosen, and of choosing in return. Clara, sensing the shift in the atmosphere but misunderstanding its source, looked from her sister's composed face to her mother's distant one, her own expression one of curious confusion. She placed the last dried plate on its shelf with exaggerated care, as if a loud noise might shatter the delicate tension. Ruth finished washing the final pot, the cast-iron bottom scraping against the sink. She pulled the plug, and the water gurgled down the drain, a sound of finality. Wiping her hands on her apron, she turned, her eyes seeking her mother's, the unasked question hanging between them in the steam-fragrant air. Eleanor, clutching the now damp towel, met her gaze, and in that look, decades collapsed. She was both the young woman on the swing, her future a beautiful, frightening blank page, and the mother at the sink, the text of her own life largely written, reading the first lines of her daughter's new chapter. The kitchen, for all its warmth, suddenly felt charged with the cool, vast weight of time itself, flowing like an invisible river around their three still forms. Clara, unable to bear the weight of the silence any longer, broke it with the directness of youth. Having placed the last dried plate upon its shelf, she turned, her eyes bright with curiosity in the lamplight. She looked not at Ruth, who was calmly wiping down the scrubbed sink, but at Eleanor, whose gaze seemed fixed on some point far beyond the kitchen's warm walls. The question was inevitable, a spark seeking tinder in the memory-laden air. "Mama," Clara began, her voice a soft intrusion, "what was it like when Papa courted you?" She leaned against the cupboard door, her earlier fatigue forgotten, replaced by an eager hunger for narrative, for a thread connecting the prosaic present to a romantic past. Was he very formal? Did he bring flowers? Eleanor blinked slowly, the distant point resolving back into the familiar contours of her kitchen, the gleam of the clean stove, the shadowed pattern of the linoleum, the expectant face of her youngest daughter. A small private smile touched her lips, not quite reaching her eyes, which held a softer, more reflective light. She folded the damp linen towel and laid it neatly over the edge of the dry sink, buying a moment to gather the scattered fragments of that lost season. She did not speak of formality or flowers. Instead, she offered a single luminous snapshot, a scene painted with the quiet pigments of memory. Her voice, when it came, was low and melodic, blending with the faint hiss of the cooling stove. She described a porch swing, not this farmhouse's broad front porch, but the narrower, sagging veranda of her girlhood home. The wood painted a grey that shimmered silver in the moonlight. The swing's chains, she recalled, had a particular musical complaint, a rhythmic groan that became the bass note to their whispered conversations. It was never about grand declarations, she explained, her eyes now seeing not Clara but the ghost of her own younger self perched on that swing. It was about the space between words, the shared silence that felt more profound than speech. John would come after his own long day, the scent of sun on cotton and honest sweat still clinging to his shirt. They would sit in the deepening twilight, the swing moving in a gentle pendulum arc that seemed to measure the slow beat of their hearts. They spoke of small things, the health of a calf, the progress of the corn, a book he was struggling to read by lamplight. But each ordinary topic was a vessel, carrying the unspoken cargo of their growing affection. And then Eleanor shared the detail that for her had crystallized the entire feeling of that time. The fireflies. As full darkness settled, the meadow beyond the porch would begin to spark, not dozens but hundreds, thousands of them, until the black air itself seemed to pulse with a chaotic, silent music of light. They did not watch the fireflies as a spectacle. The insects became the atmosphere of their courting, a living veil of gold-green sparks dancing around their private world. John, once in a moment of uncharacteristic poetry, had whispered that the flickering lights looked like the embers of their spoken words, cast out into the night to glow a while before fading. That was the moment, Eleanor confessed softly, her hand unconsciously resting on the cool porcelain of the sink, when she knew the quiet, steady man beside her held a universe of thought and feeling beneath his practical exterior. Clara listened, utterly still, her imagination painting the scene in vivid colours. Ruth, too, had paused in her wiping, her hands still, the letter from the distant schoolteacher with its tidy script and proper inquiries seemed to pale, becoming a mere document next to this living memory of whispered words and magical light. The practical concerns of the present, the mending, the accounts, the unknown future retreated, soothed by the timeless rhythm of the story. The memory ebbed as gently as it had come. Eleanor gave a slight shake of her head, as if returning from a long journey, and picked up the last item from the drainboard, a single teaspoon. She polished its bowl to a high shine, her reflection warping in its curved surface. "Time for bed," she said, her voice regaining its usual gentle firmness, the spell of the past receding but leaving its warmth behind. Clara, satisfied, nodded and made one final circuit of the kitchen, ensuring every chair was pushed neatly under the table. Ruth hung her apron on its hook, the letter and its implications temporarily shelved alongside the clean dishes. Eleanor placed the dried teaspoon in its drawer and then moved to the lamp on the shelf. With a soft puff, she extinguished the flame. Darkness rushed in, immediate and complete, but it was a friendly, expected darkness. The residual heat from the stove breathed against their skin. Their eyes adjusted, finding shapes by the faint bluish light filtering through the window from a star-smeared sky. The kitchen was now a landscape of orderly shadows, the dark hump of the stove, the pale squares of the cupboard doors, the gleam of the sink's rim. Everything was in its place, the chaos of the meal and the weight of conversation neatly resolved into silence and stillness. Eleanor herded her daughters toward the doorway, her hands gentle on their backs. She paused for one last look over her shoulder into the room. It was more than clean, it was at peace, a vessel emptied and ready for the morning's renewal. The memory of fireflies, of a groaning swing, of a young man's whispered poetry, lingered like a faint sweet scent in the cool air. Then she pulled the door closed with a soft, definitive click, leaving the kitchen to its orderly darkness, a silent keeper of secrets and stories, resting until the next day's light would call it back to life. The kitchen, left in its tidy gloom, was a stage after the actors had departed. The family migrated to the parlour, drawn by the promise of softer light and the evening's final, most intimate act. This room was the house's quiet heart, reserved for Sundays and evenings, its air smelling faintly of lemon oil and the roses from last summer's potpourri. Eleanor lit 2 more lamps, their glass chimneys glowing like captured moons, pushing the shadows back to the corners where they pooled around the horsehair sofa and the dark bulk of the upright piano. The light fell in warm pools on the floral carpet, worn thin in paths between the furniture, a map of their nightly journeys. Ruth settled into the low rocking chair by the east window, the one that caught the morning sun but now held only the reflection of the lamplight. From a basket at her feet, she lifted her current work, a linen tea towel destined for her hope chest. The design was already traced in faint blue lines, an intricate border of interlocking vines and strawberries, a symbol of fertility and hope. She selected a skein of crimson thread, the colour of ripe fruit, and threaded her needle with a single fluid motion. Her head bent over the fabric, her entire being focused into the point of the needle. Each stitch was a tiny, deliberate act of faith, a knot tied to a future she could imagine but not yet see. The needle dipped and rose, a silver minnow in the sea of white linen, leaving behind a trail of perfect bloody knots. The hope chest itself, a cedar box at the foot of her bed, was slowly filling with such tangible prayers, embroidered linens, crocheted lace, a set of monogrammed pillowcases. This nightly ritual was her conversation with tomorrow, conducted in a silent language of thread and pattern. Across the room, at the drop-leaf desk that had been her father's, Clara laboured under a different discipline. A single student's lamp cast a brilliant circle onto a sheet of foolscap, leaving the rest of her in dramatic shadow. Her brow was furrowed in fierce concentration, the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth. She was practicing her penmanship, copying a verse from a poetry book open beside her. The goal was a smooth, even script, but her young hand still fought the pen, resulting in letters that wobbled with effort. The tails of her *G, *S, and *Y, *S, swooping with uncontrolled enthusiasm. The scratch of the nib was a counterpoint to the silent sweep of Ruth's needle. Each completed line was a small victory over chaos, an attempt to impose order and beauty on the blank page, much as her sister did on cloth. The lamplight gleamed on the wet ink, making each word shine briefly before drying into permanence. Eleanor took her place in John's armchair, the one with the faded tapestry cushion. She reached for the book on the side table, a novel from the lending library, its spine cracked, its pages softened by many hands. She opened it to the ribbon marking their progress, and after a moment of settling began to read aloud. Her voice was not dramatic or performative. It was a steady, clear thread, weaving through the quiet room. It had the same quality as the lamplight, warm, consistent, illuminating. She read of English moors and windswept loves, of dilemmas and resolutions that felt both distant and intimately familiar. The words were not hers, but in her delivery, they became a shared possession. Ruth's rocking chair maintained its gentle, silent rhythm, her needle pausing only at the turn of a page. Clara's pen slowed, her attention divided between the shape of her letters and the shape of the story unfolding in the air. In this way, the three separate pursuits became one unified ceremony. Ruth's embroidery, Clara's penmanship, Eleanor's reading, each was a solitary focus, yet together they formed a harmonious chord. The parlour was no longer just a room with furniture, it was a vessel of concurrent contentment. The story from the book wove around them, a spoken tapestry that connected the silent industry of their hands. A description of a storm on the heath seemed to make the lamplight cozier, the walls more protective. A moment of tenderness between characters softened the line of Ruth's concentration and made Clara's next pen stroke a little more graceful. Eleanor's voice was the loom on which the evening was woven. It held them together in a gentle, unbreakable net. As she read, her eyes would occasionally lift from the page, sweeping over her daughters. She saw Ruth's quiet absorption in her work, a woman preparing for a life of her own, and Clara's fierce battle with ink and paper, a girl still learning the world's grammar. Her heart swelled with a complex ache of love and foresight. This moment, she knew, was as fragile and perfect as a soap bubble, beautiful, transparent, and destined to change its form. Yet for now, it held. The clock on the mantel ticked its steady, indifferent rhythm, but within the circle of light and voice, time seemed suspended. They were three women in a pool of warmth, surrounded by the friendly dark, each travelling inward on the paths of their own tasks, yet never for a moment truly alone. The story Eleanor read provided a common landscape for their spirits to wander. The crimson strawberry under Ruth's needle became a detail in a fictional heroine's kitchen. The looping asterisk, winding asterisk in Clara's copybook might belong to a character's name. Their own lives and the life of the story bled into one another, enriching both. The chapter ended with a sunset, the fictional sky streaked with gold and purple. Eleanor let the last sentence hang in the air, its resonance slowly fading into the domestic sounds, the faint creak of the rocker, the soft tap of Clara's pen being set in its holder. She closed the book gently. No one spoke immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the echoes of the tale and the shared peaceful industry of the last hour. Ruth examined her embroidery, the vine now half completed, a chain of crimson life growing across the linen. Clara blew softly on her paper, surveying her lines of poetry, the ink now dry and permanent. Eleanor simply sat, her hands resting on the closed book, feeling the weight of her small, perfect world in the quiet room. The lamps burned steadily, holding the night at bay, weaving the three of them together in a tapestry of light, thread, ink, and voice, a final perfect pattern before the day's end. The comfortable silence that followed the reading was broken by a sound from the porch, not the wind, but the firm, familiar tread of boots on wood, followed by a brisk, rhythmic knocking. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more. It was a signature. Eleanor's eyes met Ruth's, and a knowing look passed between them. Clara was already halfway out of her chair, her penmanship forgotten, curiosity animating her features. "It's Mrs. Gable," she whispered, as if the woman on the other side of the door might hear. Eleanor rose, smoothing her skirt, and went to the front door. She opened it to a rectangle of deeper night, framed by which stood the substantial figure of their nearest neighbour. Hester Gable was a woman in her late 60s, built on generous lines with a face like a friendly apple, wrinkled and rosy. She was swathed in a thick shawl the colour of eggplant, and in the crook of one arm she carried a large willow basket, overflowing with what appeared to be a tangle of dark fabric. A lantern hung from her other hand, casting a wobbly circle of light at her feet. "Eleanor, my dear," Mrs. Gable's voice boomed, cheerful as a dinner bell, dispelling the parlour's hush. "Forgive the intrusion at this hour. I saw your lights and couldn't bear another minute of my own company. The silence over there is enough to drive a saint to distraction." She didn't wait for an invitation. She sailed in, bringing with her the cool, clean scent of the night, and a faint aroma of camphor from her mending basket. "You're always welcome, Hester," Eleanor said, closing the door on the darkness. The parlour seemed to shrink slightly, then expand to accommodate this new, vibrant presence. Mrs. Gable's energy was a tangible thing, filling the spaces between the furniture. "Ruth, Clara, look at you both," Mrs. Gable said, setting her lantern on the entry table and shrugging off her shawl. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, missed nothing. The embroidery in Ruth's lap, the ink-stained fingers of Clara, the book on Eleanor's chair, industry and improvement. It does an old woman's heart good. She settled herself with a contented sigh into the sofa's deepest cushion, which sighed in protest. Her basket she placed at her feet like a treasure chest. From its depths she drew a pair of steel knitting needles and a mass of grey wool that resolved as her fingers began to fly into the sleeve of a man's sock. Her needles clicked together, a rapid metallic percussion that became a new lively heartbeat in the room. Asterisk. Click, 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 click. Asterisk. It was the sound of time being usefully consumed. "Now," she began, her needles never slowing, "you'll never guess what I heard at the post office today." And so the gossip flowed, a gentle meandering stream of local news. She spoke of old man Turner's prize sow escaping and leading him a merry chase through the vegetable gardens of 3 households. She reported on the impending visit of the new county agricultural agent, a young man fresh from college, rumoured to be full of modern ideas about crop rotation. She clucked over the youngest Jenkins girl, who had been seen walking out with a boy from the railroad depot, a fellow with slicked back hair and no visible means of support. Her tone was never malicious, only deeply interested, as if the entire township were a sprawling, ongoing novel in which she was a devoted reader. Clara listened, rapt, her own small world expanding to include runaway pigs and daring courtships. Ruth smiled faintly, her own needle moving in a slower, silent counterpoint to the neighbour's frantic clicking. Eleanor resumed her chair, picking up her own mending, a loose button on a petticoat, and letting Mrs. Gable's narrative wash over them. It was not intrusion, but enrichment. The parlour, which moments before had been a sealed capsule of family, now had a window thrown open to the wider community. Mrs. Gable was the breeze that came through it. After exhausting the doings of their neighbours, Mrs. Gable shifted topics with the ease of a seasoned conversationalist. "Speaking of the Jenkins girl," she said, her eyes twinkling, "reminds me of my own courting days. Not that I had to worry about railroad men. My Henry brought me a jar of his mother's apple butter on our 3rd outing, best I ever tasted. Which reminds me," she paused, for the first time letting her needles fall still in her lap. She leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've finally perfected my own recipe. Got it from my sister in Virginia, but I've tweaked it. The secret is a pinch of allspice with the cinnamon, and you must use a copper kettle if you can. Lets the sugar melt just so." She then launched into a detailed, sensory-rich description of the process, the precise type of apples, a mix of tart and sweet, peeled and cored until your fingers were stained brown, the slow simmer in the great copper kettle, the kitchen filling with a steam that smelled like autumn itself. the constant stirring with a long wooden paddle to prevent a single precious ounce from scorching, the sound of the boiling preserve, a thick volcanic plop plop plop, the testing of a droplet on a chilled saucer to see if it wrinkled just right. Her words were so vivid that the parlour air seemed to grow warm and thick with the imagined scent of cooking apples and spice. Clara's stomach gave an audible rumble, making Mrs. Gable laugh, a rich rolling sound that shook her shoulders. "I'll bring you a jar, child. Don't you fret," she promised. "Spread on a hot biscuit. It's a taste of heaven." She took up her needles again, and the clicking resumed, a comforting metronome to her storytelling. She shared other, smaller recipes, a salve for chapped hands made from beeswax and lavender, a trick for keeping moths out of woolens with dried rosemary. As she spoke, Eleanor watched the room transform. Mrs. Gable's presence had woven their solitary evening into the larger fabric of the neighbourhood. The click of her needles was the sound of shared labour. Her gossip was the map of their shared world. Her recipes were the passed-down wisdom of generations of women who preserved, mended, and sustained. The loneliness that could sometimes seep into the corners of the farmhouse, especially after dark, was banished utterly. Here was company, unpretentious and warm. Here was proof that their home was not an island, but part of an archipelago, each house glowing with its own light, connected by lanes and shared stories. After an hour, Mrs. Gable's sock had grown several inches, and her basket of news seemed finally emptied. She gave a great, satisfied stretch, her needles coming to a final, definitive asterisk click. "Asterisk. Well," she announced, gathering her wool, "I've talked your ears off and monopolized your evening. Henry will be wondering if I got lost in a ditch." She rose, a monumental and friendly upheaval, and began wrapping herself in her shawl. The goodbyes were warm and lingering at the door. Promises of apple butter were renewed. Mrs. Gable reclaimed her lantern, its light making her face a kind, wrinkled moon in the darkness. "You keep those lights burning, Eleanor," she said, her voice softening. "It's a comfort to see them down the lane." Then she was gone, her firm tread fading into the night, her lantern bobbing like a captured star until it disappeared behind the hedge. Eleanor closed the door. The parlour felt different, warmer somehow, and louder in its silence, as if the echo of the clicking needles and the robust voice still vibrated in the air. The sense of community Mrs. Gable brought lingered like the phantom scent of apple butter and spice, a palpable reminder that their circle, while intimate, was part of a wider sustaining whole. The door clicked shut, sealing the warmth and light inside. For a long moment, Eleanor stood with her hand on the cool porcelain knob, listening to the night absorb the last sounds of Mrs. Gable's departure, the crunch of gravel, the faint jingle of her lantern, the distant call of a good night. Then there was only the profound, listening quiet of the house itself. The lively current of gossip and recipe sharing had ebbed, leaving behind a stillness that felt deeper, more resonant, for having been so recently broken. She turned back to the parlour. Ruth was already tidying, gathering the teacup Mrs. Gable had used, her movements smooth and automatic. Clara lingered by the window, peering into the blackness as if she could still see the bobbing lantern. The room held the ghost of the visit, a slight indentation on the sofa cushion, a faint lingering scent of camphor and wool. The memory of laughter now dissolved into the ticking of the mantel clock. Eleanor extinguished the extra lamp Mrs. Gable's presence had warranted, and the room contracted, the circle of light drawing tighter around the hearth. "Bedtime, Clara," Ruth said softly, her voice a gentle intrusion on the quiet. Clara nodded, offering no protest for once, and trailed after her sister as they carried the supper dishes from the parlour back to the kitchen. Eleanor followed more slowly, pausing to straighten a doily on the arm of the sofa, to nudge the fire screen back into perfect alignment with the hearth. These tiny adjustments were a way of reclaiming the space, of restoring the intimate order that existed just for the three of them. The neighbours' cheerful invasion, welcome as it was, had left a subtle disarray in its wake, not of objects but of atmosphere. Soon, the sounds of the girls preparing for bed drifted down the staircase. The creak of a floorboard, the soft rush of water in the basin, the murmur of their voices, a private duet. Eleanor moved through the downstairs rooms, performing the final solitary ritual of the evening. She checked the bolt on the front door, its heavy iron slide a satisfying note of security. She banked the kitchen stove, the red embers collapsing under a blanket of ash with a soft sigh. In the parlour she stood before the fireplace, watching the last log break apart into a bed of pulsating coals that painted her face in warm, shifting light. It was in this hushed, in-between time, after the day's labour and the evening's company, that the weight descended. It was not a sudden crash, but a gradual settling, like fine silt in a still pond. The responsibilities, the endless ledger of a farmhouse without a man's labour, the careful guidance of 2 daughters on the cusp of womanhood, the preservation of a legacy with dwindling resources, these were familiar burdens, carried in the muscles of her shoulders and the set of her jaw during daylight hours. But now, in the silent heart of the night, they transformed. They became the absence that gave them shape. The silence was not empty. It was sculpted by what was missing. It was the silence where John's voice should have been, offering a comment on Mrs. Gable's news or a quiet joke about the apple butter. It was the space where his larger calming presence would have filled the doorway, where his hand would have rested on her shoulder as they listened to the girls upstairs. Her feet carried her, almost without volition, to the small cherrywood secretary in the corner. She opened the drop front, and the familiar scent of old paper and lemon oil rose to meet her. There, propped against the back panel, was the photograph. It was a formal studio portrait, taken not long after their wedding. John stood stiffly in his best suit, his hand on the back of the chair where she sat, her own hands folded in her lap, a bouquet of silk lilies resting against her skirt. They both looked so young, their expressions serious, almost startled by the permanence the camera implied. Eleanor lifted the heavy leather-bound frame. The glass was cool against her fingertips. She did not sit, but stood holding it in the firelight, allowing the careful composure of the day to finally, fully dissolve. The mask of capable widowhood, of steadfast mother, of gracious neighbour, fell away. Here, in the private communion with this frozen moment, she permitted herself to feel the unmasked raw edge of her grief. It was not the sharp, blinding pain of the early months, but a deeper, more chronic ache, a hollowed-out place within her, that the busyness of the day could fill with temporary noise, but which the silence always revealed anew. Her thumb traced the outline of his face behind the glass. The photograph did not capture his true smile, the one that started in his eyes and took its time reaching his lips. It did not capture the way he would squint looking toward the horizon, or the gentle roughness of his hand over hers. It was a ghost, a pale sketch, yet it was all she had of that physical presence, a silent, 2-dimensional memory. The fire popped, sending a tiny spark skittering across the hearthstone. A log shifted, and the light wavered, making the young faces in the photograph seem to flicker, almost alive. Tears came then, not as a storm but as a slow, quiet welling. They blurred the severe lines of the studio backdrop, making the young Eleanor and John swim in a watery haze. She did not sob, her breath hitched only once, a small caught sound that was absorbed instantly by the waiting quiet of the house. This was her allowed moment. This was the tribute she paid in the secret chapel of the night. To miss him, to feel the sheer staggering fact of his never coming back, to acknowledge the loneliness that was her constant silent companion, even amidst the love and bustle of her daughters. Upstairs, a door closed softly. The sound was a lifeline thrown into the depths of her solitude. It was the sound of the present, of life continuing, of her reasons for rising each morning. She took a long, shuddering breath, deep and deliberate, drawing the quiet air into the hollow places. With the hem of her apron, she carefully wiped the glass of the photograph, clearing the blurred images, restoring their sharp, solemn edges. She placed the frame back in its niche with precise tenderness, closing the secretary's front with a gentle click. Composure returned, not as a facade, but as a realignment. The grief was not gone. It was simply returned to its proper chamber within her, acknowledged and honoured. It was part of the foundation now, a stone in the hearth of her life. She smoothed her hair, straightened her spine, and felt the familiar weight of her responsibilities settle back onto her shoulders, not as a crushing burden, but as a familiar, purposeful yoke. She was here. The house was quiet, but it was safe, Her daughters slept. The fire guarded the hearth. She took up the lamp from the table, its flame steady once more. With one last look around the parlour at the chair where Mrs. Gable had laughed, at the sofa where her daughters had listened, at the secretary holding the past, she turned and moved toward the stairs. The circle of light moved with her, pushing the shadows gently back. The weight of the silence remained, but she carried it within her now, a part of her substance, as she climbed toward the living sounds of breath and dreams, leaving the quiet hours to keep their vigil below. The quiet of the parlour, still vibrating with the recent departure and the private grief, was gently pierced by the sound of a small deliberate cough from the doorway. Clara stood there, already in her long white nightgown, her hair a dark loose cloud around her shoulders. One hand held a flickering candle in a tin holder, its light making her face a pale, solemn oval. The other hand was wrapped tightly around the neck of a well-loved rag doll. She did not need to speak. Her presence was a question, a silent petition for the final ritual that would anchor the day. Eleanor, her own composure restored to its practiced calm, smiled and set aside the mending she had not truly been seeing. She rose, her joints protesting slightly after the long stillness, and took up her own lamp. "Ready for stories among the stars?" she asked, her voice warm and low, weaving a spell of normalcy. Clara nodded, her seriousness breaking into a relieved grin. She slipped her free hand into her mother's, her fingers cool and trusting. They climbed the stairs together, a slow procession of light and shadow. The steps groaned familiarly under their weight. The upstairs hallway was a tunnel of deeper darkness, the closed doors of Ruth's room and the spare bedroom like blank faces. But Clara's door at the end stood open, a square of faint bluish light from the window marking its threshold. They entered the small room, and Eleanor set her lamp on the dresser, its flame joining the cool starlight that seeped through the glass. The bedtime ritual began, a sequence as comforting and immutable as the rising moon. Eleanor poured water from the pitcher into the wash basin, testing the temperature with her wrist. Clara scrubbed her face with a flannel cloth, the water turning grey with the day's dust from the road. She brushed her teeth with salt and soda, making fierce comical faces in the small mirror. Then she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her back to her mother, while Eleanor took up the hairbrush. The brush was silver-backed, a wedding gift from an aunt. Eleanor drew it through Clara's thick chestnut hair with long, smooth strokes, each one a silent benediction. The rhythmic sound was a lullaby in itself, the crackle of static electricity forming tiny, fleeting constellations around Clara's head. When the tangles were gone and the hair fell in a sleek curtain, Eleanor divided it into 3 sections with her fingers. She began to braid, her movements deft and sure, weaving the strands over and under, pulling just tight enough to hold but not to pinch. The braid grew, a thick living rope, and when she reached the end she tied it off with a scrap of blue ribbon, the same colour as Clara's eyes. This nightly plaiting was more than mere grooming. It was an act of ordering the chaos of the day, of gathering loose ends into something neat and contained, ready for the untangling of dreams. Clara knelt then by the bedside, her hands clasped on the patchwork quilt, her braid hanging over one shoulder. Eleanor knelt beside her, the floorboards hard against her knees. They said the prayers together, the old familiar words flowing in a whispered duet. "Now I lay me down to sleep." The plea for protection, the naming of loved ones, the simple gratitude for the day. Clara's voice was soft but clear, her faith still a straightforward, untroubled thing. Eleanor's own whispers held the weight of a woman who knew exactly what she was asking protection from, and why gratitude was a necessary discipline. After the Amen, Clara scrambled under the covers, but instead of settling, she turned her face toward the window. The sky was a deep velvet black, pierced by a brilliant scattering of stars. The moon had not yet risen, and the constellations hung with icy clarity. "Mama," Clara whispered, as if the stars themselves might be listening. "Which one is Papa's?" The question was not unexpected. It was part of the astronomy of their grief. Eleanor leaned over, tucking the quilt firmly around Clara's shoulders. She followed her daughter's gaze to the glittering expanse. "I don't think he's any one of them, darling," she said softly. "But he helped you find the dipper, remember?" She pointed to the unmistakable shape of the Big Dipper, its handle, arching over the dark silhouette of the barn roof. Clara nodded, her eyes fixed on the familiar pattern. "Tell the story," Clara implored, snuggling deeper into her pillow. "The one about the shepherd." It was an old tale, not from a book, but from the folk memory of Eleanor's own grandmother, a story told to make sense of the dizzying multitude overhead. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, one hand resting on the mound of Clara's side. Her voice took on the cadence of legend, low and rhythmic. She spoke of a time when the sky was empty and dark, and a young shepherd boy, lonely in the high hills, wished for company during his long vigils. He was a kind boy, and he spent his days saving lost lambs and mending broken fences for his neighbours. The Sky Father, seeing his gentle heart, gave him a bag of luminous pebbles and told him he could scatter them above as he saw fit. The boy was careful. He placed the brightest pebbles in patterns that reminded him of things he loved: a drinking gourd for the thirsty animals, a mighty hunter with a belt of 3 stars, a queen sitting on her throne, but he saved the smallest, faintest specks of light, the dusty ones at the bottom of the bag. These he simply tossed in great sweeping arcs across the heavens, where they settled like a spray of diamond dust. "For the dreams that have no shape yet," the boy had said, "and for all the stories that haven't been told." Clara's breathing had grown slow and deep. Her eyes were on the Milky Way, that hazy river of unresolved light splashed across the dark. "So the dimmest stars are for the future?" she murmured, her words slurring with sleep. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, stroking her hair, "for all the things we can't quite see, but are there all the same." She watched as Clara's eyelids finally, heavily closed. The starlight caught on the curve of her cheek, on the dark fan of her lashes. The room was a perfect capsule of peace. The steady flame of the lamp, the infinite cold fire beyond the glass, the warm, breathing child between. Eleanor remained for several minutes, listening to the soft, regular sound of Clara's sleep. The weight she had felt downstairs was still present, but here, in this room, it was balanced by a profound, aching tenderness. This was what the silent labour was for, this safe harbour, this anchored love. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to Clara's forehead, a touch as light as a moth's wing. "Sweet dreams among the stories," she breathed. Then, moving with the quiet of a shadow, she rose. She took her lamp and went to the door, pausing for one last look. Clara was a small, still mound under the quilt, her braid a dark line on the white pillow, her rag doll tucked under her arm. The stars kept their silent, vigilant watch through the window. Eleanor pulled the door closed until only a thin crack of light remained, a golden seam in the darkness, and turned to face the quiet house and the daughter who waited, awake and thoughtful, downstairs. The house held its breath. Clara's soft, rhythmic breathing from upstairs was the only sound, a faint thread woven into the fabric of the night. Downstairs, the parlour felt both expansive and intimate, a world reduced to the sphere of lamplight surrounding the 2 women. Ruth had not resumed her embroidery. She sat on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, watching the last embers in the fireplace crumble into ash. Eleanor, in her armchair, felt the weight of the unspoken letter settle between them, a presence as tangible as Mrs. Gable's basket had been earlier. The time for stories of the past was over. The present, with all its practical uncertainties, demanded its due. Eleanor picked up her mending basket, but she did not take out any work. Her fingers traced the smooth willow rim. She began not with the letter, but with the foundation. Her voice was quiet, a careful probe into the quiet. "You've built a good life here, Ruth," she said, her eyes on her daughter's profile. "The sewing, the accounts you keep for the farm, there's a strength in that, an independence." Ruth nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the dying fire. The words were an acknowledgement of the invisible architecture of her days, the precision of her stitches, the neat columns of numbers in the ledger, the quiet competence that had become her nature. It was a life of visible usefulness, its boundaries defined by the farm's fences and the familiar road to town. "Independence is a kind of safety," Ruth replied after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know its shape. You know what it requires of you." Eleanor heard the unspoken counterpoint. That marriage was a venture into the unknown, a surrender of that known hard-won shape. She set the basket aside and leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, bridging the space between them. "It is a different kind of requirement," Eleanor agreed. "Not less, but shared. The weight is divided, but so is the direction. You are no longer the sole captain of your own ship." She paused, choosing her words as one might choose stones for a crossing. This man, this schoolteacher, his letters speak of order, of prospects. That is a good foundation, but a foundation is not the living house. Ruth finally looked at her, her eyes searching her mother's face for more than just reassurance, for wisdom, for a map. "How do you know if the house can be built?" she asked. The metaphor had taken root, providing a safer language for their fears. "You look at the land," Eleanor said gently. "Not just the plot he offers, but the soil of his character. Is it patient? Is it kind? Does it have depth enough for storms and drought?" She thought of John, of his steadfastness, the way his patience was like the deep, loamy soil of their bottom field. His letters are tidy. That suggests a careful mind. But do they make you feel, seen, or merely assessed? Ruth's composure softened, a crack in her calm facade revealing the vulnerable young woman beneath. She looked down at her own hands, the capable seamstress's hands. "They are respectful," she said. "They are sensible, but they do not speak of fireflies." The reference to the earlier story hung in the air, a luminous benchmark of a different kind of courtship. A smile touched Eleanor's lips, bittersweet and understanding. "Not every courtship has fireflies, my dear. Some are lanterns, steady, reliable light to see the path ahead. There is great value in that." She sighed, a soft exhalation that held decades of experience. "The practical fears are the ones we must speak aloud. The distance, leaving Clara, leaving this." Her gesture took in the room, the house, the very essence of the life they had forged together. Those are real weights. They must be placed on the scale, honestly. Tears welled in Ruth's eyes, not falling but glittering in the lamplight. "The thought of leaving you to carry everything alone, it feels like a betrayal." The word was stark, painful, and utterly sincere. Eleanor's heart ached with a fierce, proud love. She rose and moved to sit beside Ruth on the sofa, taking one of her daughter's cool hands in both of her own. Her touch was warm, a grounding anchor. "Listen to me," she said, her voice firm yet tender. "My life, my work, is to see you build a life of your own. That is not a betrayal. It is the fulfillment of my deepest hope. This house, this land, it is a trust I keep. It is not a chain to bind you." She looked into Ruth's tear-bright eyes. "The bond of family is not a fence, Ruth. It is a root system. It holds you firm no matter how far you grow. You would not be tearing yourself away. You would be sending out a new shoot. The connection remains, living and deep." She squeezed her hand. "Clara will miss you terribly. I will miss you every hour, but we will not be diminished by your going. We will be expanded by your happiness." They sat in silence for a long moment, the truth of the words settling around them. The clock ticked. An ember collapsed in the grate with a whisper of sparks. The practical fears had been named, and in the naming had lost some of their terrifying power. They were not monsters, but considerations, difficult but manageable. "What if I choose wrong?" Ruth whispered, the final fundamental fear laid bare. Eleanor lifted a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from Ruth's forehead, a gesture from her childhood. "There is no perfect choice, only a chosen path. You build the house together, day by day. You choose each other, even on the days when the wind blows cold. That is the marriage, not the promise, but the daily renewal of it." She thought of her own marriage, of the countless unremarkable days that had woven the strongest fabric. If his character is good land, and your heart says you can tend it with him, then that is the direction to walk, not without fear, but with hope, as your companion. Ruth leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, a rare gesture of utter reliance. Eleanor rested her cheek against her daughter's dark hair. The parlour was utterly still, a sanctuary within the sleeping house. They had not solved anything, not really. The letter still awaited a reply. The future remained an unmarked road, but the love in the room was a solid, palpable thing, a force that made the unknown feel less like an abyss and more like a horizon. The unbreakable bond had been tested in the speaking, and had proven itself not as a constraint, but as a foundation more solid than stone. It would hold, no matter what was built upon it. Eventually, Ruth sat up, wiping her eyes with the heels of her hands, a new resolve squaring her shoulders. She did not speak of her decision, but the anxious knot within her seemed to have loosened. Eleanor rose, her own heart full of a painful, proud serenity. She kissed the top of Ruth's head. "We will speak more in the light of day," she said. "For now, just know you are loved, and you are free. That is your true independence." She picked up the lamp, its flame steady. "Come, the night is deep, and tomorrow has its own demands." Together, they left the parlour, the conversation folded carefully between them, a finished piece of work for the evening, as the house slept on around them. The quiet of the house after Ruth ascended the stairs was of a different quality than before. It was a settled quiet, the silence of a concluded day, of thoughts spoken and hearts unburdened. Eleanor stood for a moment in the dim hallway, listening to the distinct sounds of the night, the groan of a timber cooling, the faint papery rustle of a mouse in the wall, the relentless chorus of crickets from the meadow, a sound so constant it became part of the silence itself. Her final duty awaited, a solitary ritual of guardianship that would seal the home from the vast, indifferent dark outside. She went first to the kitchen, the room now a cave of shadows smelling of soap and cold ashes. The banked fire in the stove was her primary concern. She opened the iron door slowly, the hinges whispering. Inside, the coals glowed with a deep, secretive crimson, like the heart of a sleeping beast. Using the long, blackened poker, she carefully nudged the remaining fragments of wood into a tight central mound. Then she scooped ashes from the ash drawer below and sifted them gently over the embers, a soft grey blanket that would smother the fire's breath but preserve its latent heat for the morning's kindling. The process was meditative, a dialogue with the element that warmed and fed them. As she closed the stove door, the faint metallic click was a promise of continuity. The kitchen, without its fiery heart, grew instantly cooler, the warmth retreating into the very walls. Next, the doors. She moved through the downstairs with her lamp held aloft, its light painting small, swaying islands of familiarity in the sea of darkness. The front door's bolt was a heavy, polished brass shaft. She slid it home with a solid, satisfying asterisk thunk, asterisk that resonated in the wood, a sound of definitive closure. The back door, which led to the porch and the yard, received the same treatment. She tested the latch, her hand firm on the cool porcelain knob, ensuring it had caught properly. Each secured door was a barrier drawn, a symbolic and practical line between the sanctuary within and the boundless night without. The windows, with their simple hook latches, she checked with a touch, her shadow looming large and protective on the walls behind her. Her final outdoor task required stepping across that line. She took her heavy shawl from its peg and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders before lifting the latch of the back door, the night air rushing in to meet her, cool and damp with dew. She left the door slightly ajar, a tacit understanding with the darkness that she would return. The porch boards were rough and cold under her stockinged feet. The sky was a breathtaking expanse of black velvet, dusted with an impossible multitude of stars, the Milky Way a luminous ghostly river flowing directly over the roof of the barn. The cricket's song was louder here, a pulsating rhythmic thrum that seemed the very voice of the night itself. She descended the 2 steps to the hard-packed earth of the yard, and followed the familiar path to the henhouse, a small squat building at the edge of the garden. The smell of dry earth, crushed grass, and the faint mineral scent of the creek beyond reached her. At the henhouse door she listened. From within came the soft, contented clucks and rustles of sleeping birds, a sound of feathered security. She tested the simple wooden bar that secured the door, sliding it back and forth in its brackets to ensure no clever raccoon could work it loose. Satisfied, she rested her palm for a moment against the rough-sawn wood, feeling the collective, warm life sheltered inside. It was a small stewardship, these 12 hens, but it was part of the whole. Her rounds complete, she did not immediately retreat. Instead, she walked back to the centre of the yard and stood still, her face turned upward. The shawl slipped from her head, and the immense starry dome pressed down, a spectacle of such scale it made her breath catch. The farmhouse behind her, with its single golden square of lamplight in the doorway, seemed suddenly small and brave, a lit match held against the cosmic dark, yet it did not feel insignificant. It felt precious. Her ritual of checking and securing was an act of defiance, a declaration that this small, ordered world of warmth and safety mattered. It was a prayer performed with latches and ashes. The vastness was not threatening in this moment. It was peaceful. The darkness was not an absence, but a presence, deep, quiet, and enveloping. It held the sleeping fields, the silent woods, the distant dreaming town. It held the future, unknown and full of both promise and peril. It held the past, all the days that had led to this one. Standing there, a solitary figure in the cool grass, Eleanor felt a profound sense of her role. She was the keeper of the threshold, the guardian of this flickering light. The weight of it, which sometimes felt like a lonely burden, now felt like a sacred charge. The crickets sang their endless, reassuring song. A shooting star scribed a brief silver line across the northern sky and was gone. She watched its trail fade, a reminder of transience, but the fixed stars remained, constant as her love. After a time long enough to feel the night's chill seep through her shawl, she turned her back on the magnificent, indifferent universe and walked toward the golden doorway. She crossed the porch, stepped inside, and closed the door firmly behind her, sliding the bolt once more. The night was shut out. The home was sealed. She extinguished her lamp in the kitchen, leaving the house in darkness, save for the faint blue starlight filtering through the parlor windows. Her final check was done. The fire was banked. The doors were fast. The hens were secure. The house, with its sleeping inhabitants, was a self-contained world, safe and whole. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand on the smooth banister, each step a movement from duty toward rest. The meditation on guardianship was complete. The peaceful darkness outside could keep its watch. Hers, for this night, was over. Sleep was a country that refused Eleanor entry. She lay in the dark, listening to the house breathe, the faint sigh of a floorboard, the distant rhythmic tick of the parlor clock, like a slow metallic heartbeat. The conversations of the evening, the weight of Ruth's unspoken decision, the memory of starlight on Clara's cheek, all swirled in her mind, refusing to settle. The bed felt too large, the quiet too profound. After an hour of fruitless stillness, she rose, wrapping her robe around her against the night's chill, and moved silently from her room. The staircase descended into deeper shadow, but a faint, unexpected glow emanated from the kitchen doorway. It was not the steady gold of a lamp, but the softer, wavering orange of a single candle flame. Eleanor paused on the bottom step, her hand on the newel post. Pushing the door open slowly, she saw Ruth seated at the scrubbed pine table, her back to the entrance. She was wrapped in a thick knitted shawl, her dark hair a loose cascade down her back. Before her, cupped in both hands as if in prayer, was a plain white mug, from which a thin aromatic steam rose, carrying the faint honeyed scent of chamomile. Ruth did not startle at her mother's quiet approach. She merely turned her head, her face pale and thoughtful, in the candle's intimate circle, the flame reflected in her eyes, twin points of restless light. "I couldn't sleep either," she said, her voice a low murmur that blended with the settling sounds of the house. It was not an apology, but a simple statement of shared wakefulness. Eleanor nodded, the unspoken understanding passing between them. She fetched her own mug from the cupboard, poured hot water from the kettle still warm on the back of the stove, and dipped a muslin bag of chamomile into it. The ritual was quiet, deliberate. She took the chair opposite Ruth, the table a small illuminated stage between them in the vast dark kitchen. For a long while, they simply sat in a companionable silence more eloquent than words. The candle flame danced and bowed with their slightest exhalations, casting their enlarged, flickering shadows onto the ceiling beams, where they merged and parted like silent dancing giants. Outside, the world was utterly still. The crickets had ceased, and the pre-dawn hush held a quality of suspended animation, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Inside, the silence was a warm, shared vessel. Eleanor watched her daughter over the rim of her mug. Ruth's gaze was fixed on some middle distance beyond the candle, seeing not the darkened pantry or the cold stove, but the uncertain landscape of her own future. The calm competence she wore like a cloak during the day was folded beside her. Here was the raw material beneath the young woman, unsure. Finally, Ruth took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes closing briefly, as if steeling herself. When she opened them, she looked directly at her mother, and the confession, when it came, was so quiet it seemed part of the shadow play on the walls. "I am afraid," she began, the words tentative, as if testing their sound. "Not of him, not really of the leaving, though that feels like tearing a piece of my own skin away." She paused, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic. "I am afraid of the asterisk ingratitude, asterisk, of wanting something more than this, when this is so much, this house, this life with you and Clara. It is a good life, a solid, honest life. It feels like a betrayal to look at it and think, is this all?" A log shifted in the foundation of the house, a deep groaning sigh. Ruth's words hung in the fragrant air, giving shape to the quiet anxiety that had haunted her steps for weeks. It was the tension between duty and desire, between the known, beloved path and the faint, beckoning trail into the unknown. Her duty was here, in the mending and the accounts, in the support of her mother and the guidance of her sister. It was a duty woven with love, which made its pull all the stronger. But the desire was a quieter, more insistent voice, a longing for a home of her own making, for a partnership, for a story that was hers alone to begin. She looked down into her tea, as if the pale, steeping flowers might hold an answer. "When I read his letters," she continued, her voice gaining a fragile steadiness, "I don't think of apple butter or runaway pigs. I think of quiet evenings in a parlour that isn't this one. I think of shelves of books that aren't ours, and part of me yearns for that quiet, and then another part screams that it is the worst kind of disloyalty." A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. It gleamed in the candlelight, a crystal testament to her torn heart. Eleanor listened, her own heart aching in sympathy. She saw not just her daughter, but the ghost of her own younger self, standing at a similar crossroads where the safe, familiar love of family grappled with the compelling, risky call of a new love. The kitchen around them, usually a realm of practical bustle, felt like a confessional in the fragile hour before dawn. The world was reduced to this pool of light, this shared vulnerability, the vast sleeping house standing guard around them. Ruth had laid bare the core of her conflict, not a fear of the future, but a terror of being unfaithful to the past. It was a weight no young woman should have to carry alone, and in the silent, candlelit kitchen she had finally set it down. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 10, Midnight Vigil, Part 2, Asterisk. Eleanor did not rush to offer solutions. She allowed the silence to hold Ruth's confession, to give it space and dignity. The candle flame guttered, then steadied, painting Ruth's tear-streaked face in gold and umber. Outside, the absolute blackness of the pre-dawn hour pressed against the windows, a void that made their small circle of light feel both fragile and sacred. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was not that of a mother issuing commands, but of a woman sharing hard-won ground from her own journey. It was a shift from authority to fellowship. "I stood once where you stand," she began, her eyes not on Ruth but on the dancing flame between them, as if the past resided in its warm core. "Not with a letter from a schoolteacher, but with the certain terrifying knowledge that your father intended to ask for me. My own mother's kitchen felt like the only safe room in the world. Leaving it felt like stepping off a cliff into cold air." She took a slow sip of her tea, the warmth travelling through her. "The feeling you describe, that it is a betrayal to want more. I knew that too. It is the oldest guilt of daughters." Ruth looked up, her eyes searching her mother's face, hungry for a map. Eleanor offered none. Instead, she offered a truth, worn smooth by time. "Love is not a single choice made at an altar," she said softly. "It is 1,000 choices made daily. It is choosing to mend the shirt instead of complaining it is torn. It is choosing to listen after a long silence. It is choosing to see the person before you, and not the dream you had of them." She thought of John, of the countless unremarkable mornings and weary evenings that had comprised their marriage. The fireflies of courtship had been beautiful, but they were not what had built the life. The building had been done with quieter materials. patience, forgiveness, shared labor, and the daily decision to turn toward one another. This life here, Eleanor continued, her gesture taking in the dark kitchen, the sleeping house. It is a good and honest life, but it is my life, Ruth, woven with my choices, my joys, my sorrows. It cannot be the blueprint for yours. To ask that of you would be the true betrayal. Her words were a gentle absolution, dissolving the knot of disloyalty Ruth had tied around her heart. Your duty is not to replicate my days. Your duty is to live your own, fully and without this borrowed guilt. She reached across the table, her work-worn hand covering Ruth's. The connection was solid, a bridge across the years. The man who writes those tidy letters, he offers a plot of land. You must decide if you wish to build there, but remember, you bring your own timber, your strength, your skill, your good heart. A marriage is not a man giving a woman a life. It is two people agreeing to construct one together with the materials they each possess. The candle was burning low now, the pool of melted wax deep around its base. The flame shrank, causing the shadows on the walls and ceiling to stretch and sway, elongating into grotesque then graceful shapes. The room seemed to breathe with the shifting light. In this intimate dwindling glow, the abstract fears of ingratitude, of the unknown, began to lose their sharp edges. They were replaced by a more manageable, practical consideration. Was the schoolteacher a man with whom Ruth could imagine making those daily, unglamorous choices? Ruth turned her hand under her mother's, lacing their fingers together. She did not speak for a long time. The silence was no longer fraught, but thoughtful, a quiet workshop where her soul could assemble the pieces she had been given. Eleanor's wisdom was not a command, but a compass, pointing north to the principle of courageous selfhood. The love that bound them was not a chain, but the steady ground from which Ruth could launch herself, if she chose. Finally, Ruth took a deep, shuddering breath, as if inhaling the new understanding. "I don't know if I love him," she whispered, the raw honesty a testament to the safety of the moment, "but I think I could choose to try." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "That is the beginning of everything," she said. "Not a feeling, but a decision to try. The feeling may follow, it may not, but the choice to build something good, with a good man, that is a worthy foundation." The candle flame gave a final, vigorous leap, then began to sink, the wick drowning in its own wax. The light dimmed, pressing the darkness closer around their table. In the near dark, details faded. They were no longer mother and daughter bound by roles, but two women, one who had navigated the passage, and one who stood on its shore, sharing the watch in the deep of night. Words were no longer necessary. The unspoken understanding that settled between them was more profound than any advice. It was the recognition of Ruth's autonomy and Eleanor's unwavering faith in her daughter's ability to wield it. As the last flicker of flame surrendered, leaving a thin, ascending thread of smoke that scented the air with beeswax, Ruth stood. She carried the mugs to the sink in the thick gloom. Eleanor remained seated for a moment longer, feeling the cool night air seep into the kitchen now that the candle's tiny sun was extinguished. The vigil was over. The anxiety had been named, examined, and placed in a new, less terrifying light. It had not been solved, but it had been shared, and in the sharing halved. Ruth returned, a pale shape in the darkness. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to her mother's temple. "Thank you," she murmured, the words holding a universe of meaning. Then she turned and moved toward the hallway, her footsteps sure on the familiar path. Eleanor sat alone in the perfect dark, the ghost of the candle's after-image painted on her vision. The long shadows were gone, swallowed by a uniform blackness. Yet the room did not feel empty. It felt full of the conversation, full of the love that had just passed through it, a love strong enough to grant freedom. She rose, her bones aching, and followed her daughter upstairs, leaving the kitchen to the first faint grey hints of dawn gathering at the window. A new understanding, quiet and deep, had been reached. The vigil was ended, but the new day it heralded was yet to be written. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 11, Starlight and Memory. Asterisk, asterisk. The house settled into its deepest quiet, a living silence woven from the soft breath of her sleeping daughters and the patient endurance of timber and stone. Eleanor stood at the foot of the stairs, the echo of Ruth's whispered gratitude still warm in the air, the profound understanding from their midnight vigil, a settled weight in her chest. But sleep remained a distant shore. The conversations of the evening, the shared fears, the offered wisdom, had stirred the sediments of her own history, and a restless need for communion, not with the future, but with the past, drew her not upward to bed, but toward the parlour. She lit no lamp. The darkness was a familiar companion, and starlight through the tall windows provided a faint blue guidance. She went to the cherrywood secretary, its surface cool under her fingertips. Opening the drop front released the scent of aged paper and dried lavender. From the deepest recess, behind the ledgers and the box of receipts, she drew out a smaller, unassuming container. It was a simple wooden box, once a cigar case belonging to her father, its lid worn smooth by time and handling. She carried it to John's armchair, the one that still held the ghost of his shape, and sat, cradling the box in her lap as the starlight silvered its edges. With deliberate care, she lifted the lid. Inside lay not jewels, but a humble archaeology of a life, a carefully curated collection of keepsakes, each a fossilized moment. The air from the box carried a complex perfume, faint, powdery rose, old ink, the clean scent of linen, and the ineffable, sweet dust of years. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in, letting the past rise around her like warm water. Her fingers found the first artifact by touch, a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. She did not need to read them. The texture of the paper, the distinct confident sweep of John's penmanship under her thumb was enough. They were his early letters, written during the brief separation when he went west to secure the promise of this very land. The words had spoken of practicalities, acreage, water rights, the price of lumber, but between the lines, in the very pressure of the ink, she had always felt the unspoken current, asterisks for us, all for us. Holding them now, she travelled back to the acute loneliness of that summer, a loneliness made bearable by the solid promise in each envelope, the joy of his return, the feel of his work-roughened hand in hers at the train depot, flooded her with a warmth that had not dimmed. That joy was not lost, it was here, preserved in this fibrous pulp, a cornerstone of her history. Next, her fingertips brushed something dry and delicate. She lifted it out, a single pressed flower, a purple aster, its petals now tissue-thin, and the colour of old parchment, mounted on a sheet of foolscap. Clara, at age 5, had presented it to her after a walk, her small face solemn with the importance of the gift. "It's pretty, like you, Mama," she had lisped. The memory was a sun-dappled burst of a golden afternoon, the child's sticky hand in hers, the simple, perfect offering. That joy too was present, not as the vibrant bloom it once was, but as its essence, distilled and fragile, a testament to a moment of pure, uncomplicated love. The child who gave it was now a young woman asleep upstairs, her own future unfolding, but the flower held the eternal truth of that maternal bond. Then her hand closed around something impossibly soft and small. She drew it into the starlight, a tiny white baby's sock, knitted from the finest wool, its heel worn almost through. Ruth's. Eleanor brought it to her cheek, the yarn still whisper-soft. She was instantly transported to the rocking chair by the stove in the old smaller house, a winter wind howling outside, the incredible warm weight of her firstborn asleep against her breast, this miniature sock peeking from the swaddling blanket, the exhaustion of new motherhood, the fierce terrifying love, the deep animal contentment of that quiet rhythm, all of it rushed back, a wave of sensory memory. The joy was profound, mixed with the ache of how swiftly that tiny foot had grown, how the dependent infant had become the thoughtful woman wrestling with life's choices just hours before. The sock was a portal to the beginning of her most defining journey. She handled each item in turn, a smooth river stone John had given her on their first picnic, saying its grey streaks reminded him of the way she did her hair, a brittle, gallowed clipping, announcing Clara's winning entry at the county fair for a drawing of a barn cat, the first button Ruth ever sewed on independently, clumsily fastened to a scrap of cloth. Each object was a star in her personal constellation, a fixed point of light in the vast dark of elapsed time. With each one, she revisited the joy of its moment, the thrill, the pride, the tenderness, the peace, and with each visitation she confronted the corresponding absence. The man gone, the children grown, the specific fleeting magic of those stages forever past. Yet as she sat surrounded by these silent witnesses, a remarkable alchemy occurred. The past joy and the present solitude did not war with one another. They began to converse. The loneliness she felt in the quiet house was not a void, but a space hallowed by the love these objects represented. The silence was not empty because it echoed with remembered laughter, with whispered promises, with childish questions. Her current solitude was the deep, still pool formed by the river of those lived experiences. She had been the keeper of the flame for all of it, the courtship, the infancy, the childhood, the slow bloom into womanhood. She was still the keeper. She placed the last keepsake, a dried sprig of rosemary from her wedding bouquet, back into the box and closed the lid. The act felt final, not like shutting away the past, but like integrating it. She leaned back in the chair, looking out the window at the cold, brilliant stars, the same stars that had witnessed John's poetic fireflies, that had watched over Clara's childhood wonder, that now shone on Ruth's uncertain path. They were constant. Her love was constant. Her role had evolved, but it was not diminished. A deep, peaceful acceptance settled over her, as gentle and encompassing as the starlight. It was not resignation, but recognition. The joys housed in that box were not lost treasures to be mourned. They were the very foundation upon which she sat. They were the reason for the quiet. She had loved deeply, and that love had built this home, had raised these daughters, had shaped this life. The solitude was not a punishment, but the earned and respectful space around a story still being written, a story now branching into new narratives for Ruth and Clara. Her own narrative was entering a quieter chapter, but it was no less rich. It was a chapter of stewardship, of memory, of legacy, of this sacred silent house that held it all. She rose, the wooden box light in her hands, and returned it to its niche in the secretary. She closed the drop front, sealing the archives of her heart. The parlour was still, the stars unwavering. She felt a profound gratitude, not for the past alone, but for this present moment of clear-eyed understanding. The memories were not anchors holding her back, they were roots, allowing her to stand firm and unafraid in the changing seasons. She climbed the stairs, her steps slow and sure, the peaceful acceptance a tangible warmth against the night's chill. The quiet was no longer a weight, but a companion. The past was reconciled, the present was sufficient, and she moved toward her rest under the same timeless stars, a complete and whole woman, keeper of the light, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 12, The Storm, asterisk, asterisk. The first sound was not thunder, but a profound, listening silence. The crickets ceased their chorus mid-note. The leaves on the oak tree hung utterly still, as if the world had drawn in a breath and held it. Eleanor, lying in the deep well of her hard-won peace, felt the change through the very mattress. The air in her room grew thick and heavy, pressing down with a tangible weight. Then came the wind, not a gust, but a sudden roaring exhalation that hit the house like a solid thing. It screamed in the eaves, rattled the window sashes in their frames, and sent a loose shutter on the barn banging with a frantic, irregular percussion. Before the first brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, she was already swinging her feet to the cold floorboards. The house seemed to groan in response to the atmospheric pressure, its timbers protesting. A dazzling blue-white flash illuminated the room for a terrifying instant, freezing everything in stark, surreal relief. The washstand, the picture on the wall, her own startled reflection in the dark window. Then darkness, thicker than before. The thunder followed, not a distant rumble but an immediate colossal asterisk, crack asterisk, that seemed to originate in the very foundation, shaking the glass in the panes, and vibrating up through the soles of her feet. Down the hall, a small, terrified cry pierced the tumult. Clara. Eleanor snatched her robe and was out the door as another lightning strike flashed, painting the hallway in strobes of panic. She met Ruth in the corridor, her elder daughter's face a pale mask of calm concern, a lit candle held high in a trembling hand that betrayed her own fear. Their eyes met in the flickering light. No words were needed. The storm was an emergency that required unity. They found Clara standing in the middle of her room, not in her bed, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders like a cocoon, her eyes wide with primal fright. The rag doll was clutched to her chest. Another peal of thunder, this one a long rolling barrage that seemed to go on forever, made her whimper and cover her ears. Eleanor went to her, peeling the quilt away and wrapping her own arms around the shaking form. "To the parlour," she said, her voice firm, a command to counteract the chaos. "We'll ride it out together." They descended the stairs, a small, vulnerable procession in a cacophonous world. The house felt like a ship in a typhoon. Rain arrived, not as drops but as a solid sheet of water hurled against the north side of the house with a sound like endless gravel. It lashed the windows, seeking entry, blurring the world into a furious liquid grey. Eleanor led them to the heart of the house, the parlour, which felt marginally safer, being farther from the towering trees. Ruth lit every lamp they had, placing them on the mantel, the table, the secretary, until the room glowed with a defiant, golden warmth that made the violent flashes outside seem even more alien. They huddled together on the horsehair sofa, pulling a heavy afghan over their legs. Clara wedged herself between her mother and sister, her small body still trembling with each thunderclap. The storm was a living entity, a roaring beast circling their fragile island of light. It was too loud for normal conversation, too overwhelming for anything but the most basic human comfort, proximity. As a particularly violent gust shook the front door, Eleanor raised her voice above the din. "The storm of 07, she began, her words a deliberate anchor thrown into the tempest. "The one that took the old red barn." Ruth and Clara turned their faces toward her, their attention captured. It was a story they knew, but in the telling, it became a shield. Eleanor described the greenish-black sky, the hail the size of hens' eggs that had pounded the roof, the terrifying funnel cloud they had watched from the root cellar, a dark finger sketching ruin on the horizon before lifting away. She spoke of the aftermath, the splintered wreckage of the barn, the stunned silence, and how John and the neighbours had appeared like magic at first light, sleeves rolled up to begin the clearing. The story was not just about destruction but about survival, about community rising from the wreckage. Encouraged, Ruth offered her own memory, a summer squall when she was 12, caught far from home while berry picking. She described the sudden shocking cold of the rain, the way the path had turned into a muddy river, and the lone massive pine tree she had sheltered under, its branches a thrashing canopy, the smell of wet pine resin and ozone, so strong it burned her nose. She had been terrified, convinced the tree would be struck, but it held, and when the rain slowed to a drizzle, the world had been washed clean and sparkling, every leaf jeweled, the air sweet and new. Her story was one of shelter found in the midst of danger, of emerging into a transformed world. Clara, emboldened by their voices, whispered a tale of her own, a memory of a thunderstorm just last spring when she had been convinced the booming was a giant stomping across the hills. She had hidden under the kitchen table, and Mrs. Gable, who was visiting, had crawled under with her, not to coax her out, but to share the space, whispering silly stories about a giant with a stomachache from eating too many clouds. The memory made her giggle now, a frail, beautiful sound against the wind's howl. Their voices wove together, a frail but steady bulwark against the elemental fury outside. They spoke of other storms, the blizzard of 18 that had buried the lane, the drought-breaking downpour of 2 summers past. Each narrative was a thread in a rope they collectively held, pulling themselves further from the cliff edge of panic. The stories proved a point more vital than the weather. They had endured before, they would endure now. The house, for all its groaning and shuddering, stood firm. The lamps did not flicker out. During a brief lull in the thunder, when the rain's roar was the dominant sound, Clara shifted. She untangled herself from the afghan, climbed out from between them, and then, with the unself-conscious grace of a young animal seeking warmth, she crawled into Eleanor's lap. She was getting too big for this, her limbs long and coltish, but she curled them inward, tucking her head under her mother's chin. Eleanor's arms closed around her automatically, holding the familiar, breathing weight. Ruth, seeing this, shifted closer on the sofa, her shoulder pressing against her mother's arm, her hand finding Clara's foot under the blanket and giving it a gentle squeeze. In that moment, In the warm lamplit parlour with the storm performing its violent ballet beyond the windows, they were a perfect secure unit, a triune fortress. Eleanor felt Clara's heartbeat against her own, steady and slowing, felt the solid, reliable presence of Ruth at her side. The stories had done their work, transforming fear into shared history, the external chaos into a backdrop that only heightened the profound safety within. The wind might scream, and the lightning might reveal the fleeting vulnerability of all wooden things, but here, in this circle of light and flesh and love, there was an inviolable core. They were three distinct souls, yet in the face of the storm's anonymous power, they had fused into a single unassailable entity, a family, holding fast. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 13, Mending What's Torn, Part 1, asterisk, asterisk. The storm had washed the world clean. The next evening, the air held a crystalline clarity, smelling of damp earth and bruised leaves, each scent distinct and vibrant. The parlour, which had been a fortress against the chaos, now felt like a quiet harbour in the storm's calm aftermath. The lamps were lit earlier than usual, their light a gentle amber against the deep indigo pressing at the windows. A sense of renewal hung in the house, a collective unspoken feeling that the violent clarity of the night before had scoured away more than just dust from the leaves. Ruth sat in her rocking chair, but her embroidery lay untouched in the basket. Her gaze was distant, not anxious now, but contemplative, as if she were examining the landscape of her own heart under the new clean light. Her eyes travelled the room, settling on the cedar hope chest at the foot of the sofa, then lifting to the shelves of familiar books, and finally resting on her mother, who was darning a sock by the hearth. The midnight conversation and the storm's fierce fellowship had left Ruth with a peculiar restless energy, a desire not just to think, but to do something tangible, something that honoured both the past they cherished and the future that beckoned. Her eyes fell upon the old blanket chest in the corner, a pine box with wrought iron hinges. An idea, sudden and complete, crystallized within her. She rose, her movement decisive. "Mama," she said, her voice clear in the quiet room, "I think it's time we fixed the wedding quilt." Eleanor's needle paused mid-stitch. She looked up, her expression shifting from mild surprise to deep understanding. The wedding quilt. It was not the one from her own marriage, but an older, more venerable piece made by her grandmother for her mother's trousseau. It lived in the blanket chest, brought out only on the coldest winter nights or for convalescences, its weight and history a comfort, but years of such service had taken their toll. The last time they had used it, they had noticed several patches worn to threads, the batting peeking through like shy white ghosts. "It's in a sorry state," Eleanor agreed, setting her darning aside, "but it's a big job." "All the more reason to start," Ruth replied, already moving toward the chest. The decision felt right, an act of preservation that matched her inward turning. Clara, hearing the activity from where she was reading on the rug, marked her page and scrambled up, eager to be part of whatever was happening. Together, Ruth and Eleanor lifted the heavy lid of the chest. The scent that rose was the very essence of memory. Cedar, lavender, and the faint sweet dust of decades. Folded atop the other linens lay the quilt. They drew it out with a kind of reverence, its weight substantial and comforting. Shaking it out fully required both of them, each taking 2 corners, and they carried it to the centre of the parlour rug, laying it down like a sacred map. In the full lamplight, its damage was both apparent and poignant. The quilt was a classic trip-around-the-world pattern, a vibrant mosaic of squares arranged in concentric rings of colour that seemed to swirl from a central, faded burgundy square, but the journey was fraying. Several squares along one edge were so thin, the pattern beneath had disintegrated into a vague shadow. A patch in the deep blue ring had torn clean through, a ragged window to the plain muslin backing. The binding along one side was unravelling, its threads hanging like delicate grey moss. Eleanor knelt on one side, Ruth on the other, with Clara curling at the edge to watch. They began not with scissors or thread, but with their hands and eyes, a gentle archaeology. Eleanor smoothed her palm over the quilt's surface, her touch tracing the topography of stitches and wear. Her fingers paused on a square of faded butternut yellow calico, sprigged with tiny brown flowers. "This," she said, her voice soft with recollection, came from the dress your great-grandmother wore to her own mother's funeral. She was just a girl. She saved every scrap. Her finger moved to an adjacent piece, a sturdy olive-green wool. This was from your grandfather's first hunting coat. He was so proud of it. She identified a floral chintz, its roses blurred by countless washings, a curtain from the farmhouse's first parlour, a scrap of navy serge from a deacon's suit, a vibrant, improbable square of crimson silk, now dulled from a Christmas necktie bought during a rare, prosperous year. Each fabric scrap was a sentence in a family narrative, a gingham from a childhood apron, a stripe from a railroadman's uniform belonging to a long-gone uncle, a delicate ivory lawn that had been part of a christening gown, used and reused for generations of infants, as Eleanor named them. The quilt transformed from a mere covering into a tapestry of lives. It held work and worship, celebration and loss, the mundane and the momentous, all pieced together with a thrifty, loving artistry that saw value in every remnant. Ruth listened, her earlier restlessness settling into a focused reverence. She ran her fingers over the torn blue square. This wasn't just mending cloth, it was repairing a lineage. The storm's clarity still resonated within her. It had shown her the strength of their circle, and now this quilt illustrated the depth of their roots. To mend it was to declare that this history, this particular stitched-together love, was worth preserving. Even as she contemplated a future that might lead her physical self away, she looked across the sprawling, wounded map of her family's past at her mother, the archivist of these textures, and felt a surge of gratitude for the continuity she represented. The work before them was a silent, mutual promise. Some threads might travel far, but the fabric itself would hold. Ruth fetched the sewing basket, its familiar weight a promise of order. Eleanor went to the storeroom and returned with a smaller, cherished box. Her scrap bag, a collection of fabric remnants saved from decades of dressmaking and mending. These were not random pieces but potential heirs, chosen for their strength and their symbolic fit. They spread the candidates around the quilt's border like a council of colours, a sturdy navy twill from a kraut-grown coat of Clara's, a soft faded madder red flannel from an old winter nightgown, a piece of cream-coloured sateen left from a party blouse, a swatch of forest green cotton duck from long-discarded work trousers. The selection was a quiet negotiation. The torn blue square, once part of that deacon's suit, needed a replacement of similar gravity. The navy twill was too dark, too solid. The green duck was too rustic. Eleanor's fingers lingered on the sateen, but its sheen felt disrespectful to the humble wool it would neighbour. Finally, Ruth pointed to a smaller piece of medium blue chambray, faded to the soft grey blue of a dove's wing. It was from one of John's work shirts, the last one Eleanor had mended that very first evening. The fabric had been saved, too worn for further repair but perfect for this. It was a bridge, a piece of her father's daily labour, joining the quilt's sacred history. Eleanor nodded, a silent approval that held a world of feeling. They worked side by side on the floor, the quilt a vast continent between them. Ruth, with her younger eyes and precise seamstress's fingers, took on the careful task of unpicking the ruined stitches around the damaged squares, her seam ripper moving with surgical delicacy. Each snipped thread was a tiny release, a necessary undoing before the making whole could begin. Eleanor, with her deep knowledge of grain and wear, cut the new patches. She used a cardboard template, tracing the exact size of the original squares, then wielding her shears with a confident snip. The sound was crisp in the quiet room. Then began the stitching. They threaded their needles, Ruth with a navy thread for the blue chambray, Eleanor with a spool of crimson for the red flannel destined to replace a disintegrated calico square. They bent their heads, their shoulders almost touching. The only sounds were the soft pull of thread through cloth, the occasional snip of scissors, and their own measured breathing. Clara watched for a while, then fetched her own needle and a small hoop, content to practice her stitches on a spare scrap, a silent acolyte in their ceremony of repair. The act was profoundly meditative. Each in and out of the needle was a tiny commitment. Each small, even stitch was a suture, not just in fabric, but in time. As Ruth worked the blue chambray patch into the void left by the old wool, she felt the metaphor unfold beneath her fingers. She was not erasing the past. The outline of the lost square remained in the quilting lines, a ghostly footprint. She was laying a new layer over it, a patch that spoke of her own generation's love and labour, her father's shirt, her mother's careful salvage, her own skilled hand, all converged in this 6-inch square. The quilt would not be returned to its original state. It would be renewed, made stronger by its adaptations, its history made visible in its repairs. This, she realized with a quiet thrill of understanding, was the answer to the anxiety that had plagued her. Her path might lead away from this house, just as a new patch is separate from the old cloth, but the connection, the stitches, would hold. Her life would be a new piece, shaped by her own choices and experiences, but sewn firmly to the border of this legacy. The love represented by these scraps, the resilience, the thrift, the artistry born of necessity, was not a weight to carry, but a pattern to follow and expand upon. She could leave without severing herself, because she was already part of the weave. Eleanor, attaching the red flannel patch, felt a parallel peace. She saw Ruth's intense concentration, the way her daughter's brow furrowed, not in worry, but in creative focus. This shared labour was a passing of the needle, a quiet transference of guardianship. She was teaching Ruth how to preserve, but Ruth was showing her how to adapt. The quilt would survive for more winters, would comfort Clara's children perhaps. Its story enriched by this chapter of its repair, her own role was shifting, from the sole keeper of the flame to a co-tender, and there was a deep rightness in that. They worked until the lamplight began to feel inadequate, until their necks ached from bending. 3 patches were securely stitched in place, their newness a proud, honest contrast to the surrounding antiquity. The rest of the damage was marked with pins, a promise of work to come on subsequent evenings. Together they folded the quilt, handling its renewed weight with care, and returned it to the cedar chest. It was not finished, but it was saved. The most critical tiers had been addressed. The process had been established. As Ruth put away the scissors and thread, her hands smelled of old cotton and iron. She looked at her mother, dusting lint from her skirt, and felt no tearing sense of impending departure, only a profound sense of continuity. The connections, like the hundreds of tiny stitches they had just made, were small, individual, and immensely strong. They would hold, whatever her future held. She would carry this knowledge within her, that she was both a unique piece and part of a magnificent enduring whole, a living stitch in the family fabric, mending what was torn and strengthening the pattern for whatever was to come. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 14. A New Rhythm. Asterisk, asterisk. Several nights later, a different quiet reigned in the parlour. It was not the strained silence of unspoken worries, nor the vigilant hush during the storm's fury. This was a quiet of deep absorption, a harmonious hum of 3 separate pursuits running concurrently like clear parallel streams. The air, still holding the crisp, washed-clean scent from after the rain, seemed to vibrate with a gentle, purposeful energy. The lamps cast their usual golden pools, but the light tonight felt charged with possibility, illuminating not just a room but a portrait of lives in subtle, deliberate evolution. At the drop-leaf desk, Ruth sat with a sheet of cream-coloured stationery before her, the pen in her hand poised but not trembling. The frantic anxiety that had once accompanied thoughts of the distant schoolteacher had been carded and spun into a thread of clear intention. The midnight vigil had given her permission. The mending of the quilt had provided the metaphor. She was not writing a declaration of love, nor a cold assessment. She was drafting a blueprint for a potential collaboration. Her first sentences spoke of gratitude for his correspondence and an appreciation for his thoughtful questions about her work at the dressmaker's shop. She described, with a seamstress's eye for detail, the project of repairing the old quilt, the discovery of each fabric's history, the careful selection of new patches. It was a story of preservation and renewal, offered without pressure, a piece of her world laid bare for him to consider. Her pen moved steadily, each word a careful stitch in this new, tentative fabric of connection. Her expression was one of focused calm, the lines of her face softened by the lamplight and the integrity of her task. On the rug near the hearth, Clara was curled on her side, propped on one elbow. In her hands was a book, not a school primer, but a novel from the parlour shelf, its spine cracked with age. Her brow was furrowed, not in struggle, but in the fierce, delightful concentration of a traveller lost in a new landscape. Her lips moved silently, forming the unfamiliar words, her finger tracing the line beneath them. This was independent reading, undertaken not as an assignment, but as a chosen adventure. The childish need for a spoken story, for the sound of her mother's voice weaving tales, had matured into a desire to navigate the narrative seas herself. Occasionally she would let out a small, soft gasp of surprise, or a hum of understanding, utterly engrossed. The world of the story was hers alone to explore, a sign of her own mind stretching its wings, venturing beyond the familiar circle of lamplight into the boundless realms of imagination. In the armchair, Eleanor held a small, leather-bound journal open on her lap. It was a new practice, inspired by the quiet aftermath of the storm and the profound reconciliation she had found with her keepsakes. The pen in her hand was not for accounts or lists. It hovered for a moment, then began to move. She did not write of grand events or profound philosophies. She recorded the day's small textures, the particular silver grey of the dawn sky, the industrious sound of Ruth's sewing machine from the upstairs room where she was finishing a commissioned dress, the sight of Clara attempting to teach the barn cat to sit for a treat. She wrote of the feeling of the sun-warmed linen as she hung it on the line, of the taste of the first wild strawberries from the edge of the garden. These were the stitches of her present, the daily quilting of a life that was, she now understood, still being composed. The act of writing them down was a way of honouring the quiet beauty of continuity, of bearing witness to the evolution happening so gently around her. Her face in profile was serene, the peace she had wrestled from memory, now a settled light in her eyes. The room was a symphony of silent industry, the scratch of Ruth's pen, the soft rustle of Clara turning a page, the faint whisper of Eleanor's own writing. These were the only sounds, and they blended into a kind of music. It was the sound of growth, of interior worlds expanding. They were not isolated in their pursuits. A palpable sense of companionship flowed between them, a shared respect for the sacred space of concentration, a glance, a small smile exchanged when Clara giggled at a line in her book, the silent offering of the cookie plate being pushed closer to Ruth's elbow. These were the punctuation in their silent dialogue. This was the new rhythm. It was not a dramatic change, but a subtle, powerful shift in the family's harmony. The collective activities of reading aloud or working side by side on a single project would always have their place. But this concurrent, respectful solitude, spoke of individuals becoming more fully themselves within the family vessel. Ruth was engaging with her future with clear-eyed agency. Clara was claiming her own intellectual territory. Eleanor was documenting the precious, fleeting present. Together, yet separately, they were moving forward. The evening deepened. Ruth signed her letter with her full name, *Ruth, Eleanor Caldwell, the ink dark and final. She blotted it carefully, folded it, and slid it into an envelope, a sealed vessel carrying her honest, open heart across the miles. Clara closed her book with a soft sigh of satisfaction, marking her place with a ribbon, her mind still half in the world she had been visiting. Eleanor closed her journal, its leather cover warm from her hands, a record of a day that would never come again, now preserved. Ruth stood, letter in hand, and walked to the secretary to place it with the outgoing mail. Clara stretched, a long cat-like movement, and went to kiss her mother good-night before trudging sleepily toward the stairs. Eleanor remained in her chair for a moment longer, watching them. Her heart, which had ached with the fear of change and the weight of silence, now swelled with a quiet, fierce pride. The room, still vibrantly alive with the echo of their pursuits, was a testament not to an ending, but to a beautiful ongoing transformation. The rhythm was new, but the music was theirs, and it played on into the tranquil night. Chapter 15. First Light. A subtle internal chime, tuned to a rhythm older than clocks, woke Eleanor in the absolute dark that comes just before dawn. The house was still, a vessel resting in the deep harbour of night, but she felt the faint gathering pressure of the coming day, like a change in the tide. She rose, her movements fluid and silent, a figure practiced in the art of not disturbing the peace. The floorboards were cool beneath her bare feet as she moved to the window. Outside, the world was a study in monochrome, the black shapes of trees against a sky of deep velvety indigo, the faintest suggestion of a lighter horizon to the east, a mere softening of the absolute dark. She dressed by feel in the gloom, the familiar textures of wool and cotton, a comfort against her skin. Downstairs, the kitchen was a cave of shadows, still holding the chill of the long night. Her first act was to the stove. She opened the iron door to the firebox, where last night's ashes lay like a soft grey tomb. With the poker, she gently stirred the depths, finding, as she knew she would, a few stubborn embers nestled at the very heart, glowing with a sleepy, persistent crimson. It was a small, living seed of warmth. She bent and blew upon them, her breath a focused stream that made the coals brighten obediently. Then she added slivers of kindling, dry pine that caught with a cheerful crackling whisper, and laid a small split log atop the growing flames. She closed the door, and the fire began its steady, hungry murmur, the sound of the day's first promise being kept. While the stove warmed, she pumped water into the kettle and set it on the growing heat. She measured oats into a pot, added salt and water from the pitcher, and placed it at the back of the stove where it would cook slowly, without scorching. The rituals were automatic, performed with a mindful grace that transformed core into ceremony. This was her domain, this quiet kitchen in the pre-dawn. It was a space of pure potential, where the raw materials of the day, the grain, the water, the fire, were gathered and directed towards sustenance and warmth. With the practicalities underway, she took her shawl from its hook and stepped out onto the back porch. The air was knife-cold and achingly clean, scented with wet earth and the mineral tang of the creek. The stars, which had been a brilliant multitude just hours before, were now fading, their light retreating before an imperceptible advance from the east. She stood at the railing, her hands wrapped in the wool of her shawl, and watched the sky. It began not with colour, but with a dissolution of the black. The indigo bled upward into a deep, cool grey. The shapes of the barn, the oak tree, the distant fence line, emerged from flat silhouettes into three-dimensional forms, gaining depth and texture. A single bird, a robin perhaps, offered a tentative, questioning chirp from the apple tree. It was answered by another, then another, until the silence was gently pierced by a scattered, waking chorus. Then came the light. It was not a sunrise of dramatic, flaming clouds, but a slow, gentle suffusion. A band of palest lemon appeared on the eastern horizon, so faint it seemed imagined. It widened, softening to a creamy gold, then warming to the colour of ripe peaches. This new light did not blaze, it seeped, spilling across the lower sky and washing the undersides of a few high thin clouds in rosy lavender. The world below remained in soft focus, the grass heavy with dew that glittered with a million captured points of this nascent glow. The kitchen window behind her began to reflect the changing sky, a square of gathering light in the still dark wall of the house. Standing there, Eleanor felt the profound continuity of her role. She was the keeper of this transition, the guardian who stood watch as the peace of the night was gently, inevitably, surrendered to the bustle of the day. She had lit the lamps against the evening dark, banked the fires for the long sleep, soothed nightmares, and listened to the fears and hopes whispered in the midnight quiet. She had been the constant in the centre of the turning world of her home. This dawn was not an end to that guardianship, but its quiet, triumphant conclusion. The night's peace, so carefully tended, had done its work. Her daughters slept, restored, the house rested, secure. Now, she was here to kindle the literal and metaphorical fire for what came next. The peach in the sky intensified, bleeding upward into a clear, luminous blue. The first direct ray of the sun, still hidden below the ridge, lanced across the meadow, turning the dew into a sudden, breathtaking field of diamonds. The day was no longer coming, it had arrived. In her heart, Eleanor felt a swell of quiet gratitude, so deep and full it had no need for words. It was gratitude for the silent, sacred hours that had just passed, the hours that belonged only to them, to the three souls under this roof, the hours of shared stories and solitary thought, of mending and memory, of storms weathered and new rhythms found. Those hours were the invisible stitching that held the fabric of their lives together. The daylight would bring its own demands, its own joys and separations, but the peace woven in the dark would remain, a resilient lining beneath it all. The kettle began a soft, rising whistle on the stove, a domestic summons. She turned her back on the glorious, indifferent sunrise and re-entered the warm, now golden kitchen. She poured the boiling water into the teapot, the steam wreathing her face. She stirred the oatmeal, its creamy surface bursting with slow bubbles. The smell of wood smoke, brewing tea, and cooking grain filled the room, the definitive smells of morning. Soon there would be footsteps on the stairs. Clara, sleepy-eyed and warm from her bed. Ruth, composed and ready for the day's work. They would gather at this table, in this light, and the cycle would begin anew. But for this one suspended moment, Eleanor stood alone in her kitchen, the dawn light streaming through the window to pool at her feet. She was the keeper, the guardian, the first light in her own small world, and her heart, full of a quiet, fierce gratitude, was ready to welcome the day.